Hi, my name is Daria, and today I'll be showing you how to set up a project render on the Deliver page of DaVinci Resolve. So I've already got a project set up on my workstation. I'm currently on the Edit page, where I've assembled my media into a timeline. I then went onto the Color page to perform all of my color correction and grading. And when I'm ready to export this out of the software, all I have to do is click on the Deliver icon at the bottom of the interface to enter the Deliver page. So let's take a look at this interface. We're really working with four main panels here. In the top left corner, we have the render settings. This is where you'll be performing the majority of the work. It's setting up your file format and your codecs. Next to that, you have the viewer. This is showing you the final state of your media. Anything that you did to the media in terms of adding effects or transitions in the edit page, performing any kind of effects or motion graphics on the Fusion page, and of course, all of your color grading should appear in the viewer. If anything doesn't look right, or if anything looks like it's missing, then you probably want to go back to one of those pages and address that. Otherwise, it just won't be included in the render. On the right-hand side, you have the render queue. So this is where all of your render jobs will end up. The word queue should suggest that you can have multiple renders going on at once, and that's actually a huge advantage with the Deliver page. It means that you don't have to set up one job and wait for it to be completed before setting up another one. You can essentially set up all of your renders and then either let it render overnight or just go off, for a break and come back when it's all finished. Underneath those panels, you have two versions of the timeline. So in the middle of the page, you have the thumbnail timeline, which is identical to the one that you have on the color page. So this is showing you thumbnail icons of all of the clips, regardless of their duration. So at a glance, you can tell what's graded and what's not. You can also check out their version names, codecs, and file names directly underneath the file names. Thumbnails. And you also see things like flags, which is quite important later on if we perform any kind of filtering. Beneath that timeline, you also have one that's representative of the timeline you see on the edit page. This is also extremely useful to have because you can see all of the individual video and audio tracks. It means that you can mute and solo certain audio elements. Also, you might have a version of your render that has all the titles overlaid on the video and one without. So you might be sending it off to an agency that's going to be designing custom motion graphics, and they will have a reference video alongside the one that you send without them. So it's really nice. At the top, you have timeline controls like the ones that you will find on the edit page as well, so you can navigate around the timeline and set in and out points if you have to. Now, the setting up a render, the process is actually pretty straightforward, and it's very simple to approach when you think of it as just being 3 steps. So step number 1 is to go into the render settings page and just set up the format, the codec, and any advanced settings that you're interested in. Step 2 is to identify the render range on the timeline. So you're specifying what you want to render. By default, this is set down here in the timeline as, I can't zoom in, is set to the entire timeline by default, but I could also go in there and start using my in and out shortcuts, I and O on the keyboard to define a narrower range. And then step 3 is to click on the Add to Render Queue button at the bottom of the render settings panel. 1, 2, 3, and I've added a job to the render queue. You can then repeat this process as many times as you need to for every version of your render. And when you're finally done, all you have to do is go over to the render queue and click on Start Render to start exporting your media onto your workstation. So it's a pretty straightforward process. But of course, the difficult part is setting up your render itself, making sure that you're using the appropriate codecs for the work that you're doing. So I'm going to go over here to the render settings and take a closer look at them. Right now, the panel is sort of collapsed to the top half of the page. So I'm going to use the interface toolbar at the very top of the page to expand my render settings to the full length of the page. And that's much easier to navigate now. At the top of the render settings, you're going to see a list of presets. Now, usually when you're doing any kind of creative work, a lot of people shy away from presets because they like to have full control over their setup. But in this case, these presets are actually based on various industry standards, and they're pretty much good to go. As soon as you select these, these are entirely usable. So the first two that I will see next to the custom setting, which just gives you access to all of the different file formats and codecs that you could possibly use. You have user-generated content websites like YouTube and Vimeo, and these are based on the specifications on those websites themselves. So all you have to do is click the icon and you will automatically launch those requirements. You can also use the drop-down arrows next to these icons to specify a different resolution, and that will also automatically adjust it in the render settings underneath. Next to those, you have some presets for ProRes and H.264 and H.265 masters. This is fantastic for delivering different versions or different standards to a client. So for example, if you needed a video for a client purely to review that was very light in file size and really easy to transfer online, then you would send them an H.264. But then simultaneously, you might also want to do a ProRes master, which might be the final delivery of your video project, and just set it as those two streams. Then further on, you have much more industry-specific formats like IMF, which is what high-end streaming services like Netflix use. You've also got round-trip presets that you would use with other software. So oftentimes, if you're working as a colorist, you might be receiving timelines from someone who's editing in Premiere, Avid Media Composer, or Final Cut, in which case they will oftentimes want those video files back after they've been graded so that they can continue to add effects or titles, things like that. So in that case, you'd select one of these presets, and you'll actually be delivering two things. One is the trimmed media in the timeline, containing, of course, all of the color grading data at a really high quality. And you'll also be including an XML file so that the editor is able to reconstruct the timeline on their end once they receive it. And then finally, there's also audio presets in case you're working with an audio engineer who's using something like Pro Tools. So I've got YouTube selected. I've made sure that this is set to HD, and I'm going to just scroll down and go over these settings very briefly. First of all, you've got your file name at the top, so you can just click directly on that and enter whichever name you like. I tend to be very particular about how I label my timelines on the edit page so that I never have to enter custom names. And that makes it really easy to keep track of my edit versions. If I was to send this to the client right now, they can give me feedback and they will be referring to a very specific file name. I will never work on this timeline 1.4 ever again. I will just make a duplicate of that, name it sequentially 1.5, and continue to work on that. And the default behavior of the render settings is to use whatever the label of the timeline on the edit page was. Underneath that, I have my location set to desktop. So that's also quite important to set up. If you don't have a location in the render settings, then the render just will not be able to occur. Underneath that, I'm able to specify whether I'm rendering the video as a single clip, so a self-contained video file that somebody can just launch in the video player and watch from start to finish. For certain workflows, you want to deliver individual clips, which means that every single clip in the edit is going to come out as its own file. And then beneath, I have these three tabs between which I can click and set up individual controls for the video stream, the audio, and also additional file name controls. So right now with video, I know that YouTube's preferred standard is QuickTime or MP4 in an H.264 codec, which uses temporal compression, which is absolutely ideal for online playback. I usually wouldn't change either of these settings, and I also wouldn't really touch resolution and frame rate if I've already set them up in my project settings, so I usually would be working in the format that I want to deliver. But there are a couple of settings closer down to the bottom here, which I might take a look at. So in particular, this one called quality. This is actually referring to the data rate of your video, and it has the biggest impact on the quality and the file size of your video by far. So it's worth knowing that by playing around with these numbers, you have full control over how large your file ends up, and also the quality, the visual quality of that file. There's a couple of reasons why you might want to change that. One thing could be that you might be delivering a really rough edit and you want a file that's absolutely tiny. You don't really care too much about the video quality of the frame. You're not too concerned about the accuracy of the colors. Sometimes you want something that's super easy to send across to someone that they can then review for things like tone, or pace. And then they can confirm and say, yes, we're happy with the edit, keep working and, doing the grade or the VFX. Or alternatively, sometimes you have a restriction on file size. Oftentimes when you're doing festival submissions online, they might have a limit that says no bigger than 2 gigabytes. In that case, you might be rendering out a 15-minute video and the end result could be 2.01 gigabytes. So you're just a little bit over that limit. So instead of having to crush your quality quite substantially, what you can do is just go into the restriction field and type in a slightly lower number and do another render, and you might end up with 1.99, so you are now meeting those standards. Using just a little bit of basic math, you can figure out what your file size will be using the data rate. It's just about taking those kilobits per second, multiplying it by 60 to get the result for a minute, and then of course multiplying that by 60 again to get an hour result. So I'll lower this just a little bit. I'll enter 8,000 kilobits instead of 10,000, and I'll just drop my file size a touch. I'm happy to leave the codec at AAC, which, just like H.264, is a codec that is more compressed than the standard that you get with PCM. And then finally, in the File tab, I'm going to make sure that I'm using my timeline name, and everything else is set up the way I want it to be. So I'm going to go to the bottom of the render settings, click on Add to Render Queue, and that's my first job that's now appeared in the render queue panel. I'm going to double-click job 1, and I'm going to give it a more specific name because job 1 is not very descriptive. I'll call it HD YouTube, and that will make it easier to keep track of what I was trying to accomplish with these settings. I'm also going to very quickly generate a second job, but this time what I want to do is set up some dailies. So dailies, of course, is a very common workflow in the film industry. It's when you generate compressed copies of your rushes for the editor to use. And the whole idea is that you want them to be able to play back the media in real time so that they can edit to the beat and keep track of the flow of the edit. If they were to try to work with the uncompressed media or the raw media that they receive directly from camera, they will often experience lag. That's absolutely normal. So it is important to create rushes for the edit process. Usually, you will also set up the rushes, or rather the dailies, by syncing sound, which can be performed on the media page, and also maybe applying a preliminary grade or some sort of transformative LUT on the color page so that the colors are configured to a closer range to what the final film will look like. So once these are performed, you will make sure that all of the media is placed on the timeline, every single clip. Don't trim anything. Don't try to get the pre-roll or the post-roll out. The editor absolutely needs the clapperboard information. But then all you have to do is go into the render settings, and I'm going to set this up from a custom preset. File name, I'm not going to worry about just yet. Location I'm happy with. I probably want to create a dedicated folder actually if I am doing dailies because I'm about to generate loads of files. There we go. And then I will of course make sure that I switch from rendering a single clip to rendering individual clips because I'll need to generate rushes. With the video quality, I do not want to use something like H.264, which is extremely aggressive with how it treats the video data. It's great for playback quality, but for editing, it's completely inappropriate because it drops a lot of the progressive frames. So you won't actually have the full image available to the editor. So what I'm going to do is click on the codec drop-down menu, and I will change it to something like ProRes. at the top. There we go. And then underneath that, I reveal the different ProRes types that I have. So I'll probably go for something really quite light, like 422 LT. And all the different 422 types just refer to different data rates once again. So you just go lower and you have a lighter file size. And with editing, you're not super concerned about having a video that's 100% replicated from the original rushes. Great. Something else that I might be interested in including with these dailies will be some data burn-in information. So I can activate that from the workspace menu at the top of the page. There's an option here called data burn-in. And I will get this separate interface popping up on my window. So a data burn-in is just an overlay of certain information on the video or on the rushes that's baked into the viewer. That means that multiple people can view it on multiple viewers and they will have the exact same information in front of them. I use this all the time when I'm sending out just test renders to clients, and that way when they get back to me with their feedback, they have a really specific time code that they can refer to. Using the time code off the video player is not as dependable because they tend not to show frame information, and with a fast-paced edit, that could be absolutely vital for good feedback. So while I have this open, I'm going to activate source timecode. There we go. And I'm also going to activate source file name. Ooh, actually, source clip name. That's it. That's a little shorter. Notice that at the top I have two modes for data burn-in. So right now I'm applying this information on a project-wide basis, which means that every single clip on the timeline will contain this information. But I could also switch it to clip mode, and whatever clip I have selected when I'm ticking these fields will be the only clip to contain this information. So this is really useful if you're including custom text and leaving notes for yourself, or maybe for an audio engineer or a visual effects artist. Perhaps there's a boom visible that needs to be gotten rid of. Maybe there's just some audio instructions that you're leaving for someone else. So that's pretty handy. Finally, you also have logo controls. So this enables you to leave a watermark on your video if you need to for protection purposes. When you enable the logo control, you look on the right-hand side. This is where all the settings are for every single field and the data burn-in. At the very bottom, you have import file, which is where you'll be able to assign an image as a logo and then control its positioning and opacity over your viewer. I'll deselect the logo, but I will leave the other two in place. And now I can just collapse the data burn-in interface, and I can see these on the viewer. When I jump between my clips using my arrow keys, you can see that the file names update, and so does the source timecode. So this will be pretty useful for dailies and also just for a render for approval. But sometimes I will not want this data burn-in. Instead of going back into the menu and disabling all of these fields, what might be a faster approach would be to expand the advanced settings in the render settings, and then navigate to where you have the data burn-in field, and you can select none to deactivate it on this particular render. So once again, I'm going to complete this setup by going to the Audio tab. And this time, it is still set to AAC, but I will want to switch to PCM because I will want a higher quality render of the audio stream. And finally, I'll go into File. And because these are rushes, I will want to absolutely keep the source name of the files. When you're switching between online and offline timelines or vice versa, it's much easier to reconnect your media if the file names are identical in both versions. As soon as you start renaming things, then that link will be permanently broken, and you will have to go in there and relink everything manually, which is really inconvenient. So I'll use that. You do have this additional option directly underneath source name, which is use unique file names. Now, that's not usually necessary when you're performing dailies work, but if I had an edited timeline and for whatever reason I was trying to export individual clips, I probably would want to activate use unique file names as well. The problem is that if I had multiple clips on the timeline that came from the same source media, if they all have the same source name, they will start to overwrite one another during render, and I absolutely do not want that. So by selecting Use Unique File Names, I get to specify whether there will be a unique prefix of numbers or a suffix, which is at the end of the file name, that will help identify between these source names, and that means the files won't overwrite one another. So this is absolutely vital for things like exporting media for visual effects workflows, or maybe just doing a round-trip workflow with an editor on another software. I'm going to save this as a job as well. So I'm just going to go down here, Add to Render Queue, and also label this. So I'll double-click on Job 2 title and say Proxies. Excellent. And then click off just to apply that. Let's say that I generate a lot of proxies with this client, and let's say that they use more or less the same equipment every time. Well, in that case, I might not want to set this up as a render settings job every single time. I'd rather just set it up as a preset, and then all I have to do is click the same button every time I'm ready to deliver dailies with this client. So to save a set of settings as a preset, you will need to go into the options of the render settings panel, and then in the middle here you have Save as New Preset. You get to give it a name. So in my case, I'm going to call this ProRes Dailies, and click OK. And now you should see that in the very left of my render settings presets, I now have these ProRes dailies. So that's a really handy way to just come back to previous setups that you've been using. I'd like to take a look at just a couple more setup controls on this page. First of all, something I really enjoy about the interface toolbar here is that you have the same ability to filter clips as you do on the color page. So that means that you can click on this drop-down menu next to the word clips and actually specify if there is a specific filter system that you want to use to isolate individual clips. So maybe you've only graded some of your media and you only want to send a client a render that includes the rendered clips, maybe for approval, in which case you will select graded clips and it will only show you those. Something that I do quite a lot is if I'm collaborating with another company that might be performing visual effects compositing, once the edit is completed, I will flag clips that require visual effects work. I will then filter the timeline based on just those clips, and again, send them out as individual clips, usually with some trim handles as well, which means that there will be like 12 to 24 frames on either side of the trim point. And that way, they will receive only the media they need to work on in a high-quality render. And yeah, I will do that using the clips filter at the top, using flags. And right now, I have a few green flags on the timeline. So when I press on green, I've now filtered it down to just those 3 media clips. And now if I was to add this render setting to the render queue, it will only run on those 3 clips and nothing else on the timeline. Speaking of timelines, we had set it up to this trailer that I had in place. But there's actually also a teaser that I was working on in this project. I can access it while still on the Deliver page by using the drop-down menu at the top of the viewer. So here I can see that I have a previous version of the edit that I worked on, and underneath that I have Teaser 3.0. Let me disable my filter first, so select all clips again, and then in the drop-down menu select Teaser. So that's changed my timeline. I'm now looking at a different edit and a different grade. Notice that the render queue is still showing me the jobs from the previous timeline, so that's not interfered in any way. And now I can continue to use the render settings panel to maybe configure a different setup, click on Add to Render Queue, and that will also end up in my list of jobs. But it's not just the ability to add projects from different timelines that's vital here. You can actually also set up jobs from different projects on your workstation. So, I'm working on these different timelines for this film, but maybe simultaneously I was also working on the behind the scenes for this project. And that is a completely different DRP file or DaVinci Resolve project. I can then add the render settings for that project into the render queue as well, and then just combine all of these jobs and render them out in one go. To reveal the jobs from different projects, I need to use the options menu in the render queue. So that's also this 3-dot menu in the top right corner. I can click on that, and I have this selection at the top, Show All Projects. And when I click on this, I can see that there was another job set up on a different project on this workstation, this one focusing on an audio render, so that was quite helpful. And yeah, that's all pretty much good to go. To send these projects out, I can either select one to highlight it, or I can maybe hold the the Shift key and select multiples and click on Start Render. I can also just press the first one, hold Shift, select the last one, and then click Start Render when I'm ready to go. I'm good to save my project. It's good, I got a good pop-up. All right, and it started off. Now, if you're ever uncertain about how to set up your render settings, my advice is that you look at the destination and find out what is required from you. So if you're uploading something to a website, there will almost always be some sort of specifications page or frequently asked questions page that will tell you which format they support and which codecs they prefer. If you're sending something to a festival or to a theater, again, there will usually be organizers or technicians whose job it is to provide you with this information and to support you. For broadcasters, there's a really wide range of standards based on which country they're in, whether they're using analog or digital. So again, get in touch with their technicians and they will support you and give you this information. Of course, there is also the Blackmagic forums. So come by. It is full of professional editors, full of digital technicians who do this on a day-to-day basis. And also, of course, the Blackmagic engineers themselves who will be able to answer your questions. Thank you very much for watching, and check out the rest of the videos on this page for more.